Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Drums webinar, How Your Brand Can Engage with Gen Z in association with Attest. My name is Naomi Taylor and I'll be your host this afternoon. Today we're going to be looking at how brands can cut through the noise and truly connect with this elusive audience, the ones we're all trying to reach, the generation born after millennials. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we can all agree that today we are bombarded with endless content. Brands need to work in more innovative ways to reach the future spenders who will, by 2020, account for 40% of consumers. And now that's quite a figure. A recent study from Attest has revealed that 75% of Gen Z have an ad blocker installed and are twice as likely to watch no TV, trust bloggers more than brands. Luckily, today we have the Gen Z geniuses who will be able to ease our qualms about the whole situation. So we have Mark Walker, Marketing Director of Attest, who is our webinar partner today, who provide market and brand intelligence for today's commercial leaders. We also have Marino Fresch, Marketing Director in the UK and Ireland at Eventbrite, Tanya Adlam, Vice President for Research at Discovery Networks, and we also have Beth Trundle, Head of Love Food at Social Chain. A few bits of housekeeping. We want this to be a really interactive webinar, so please feel free to ask any questions throughout at the chat box at the side of your webinar box, shall we call it. And without further ado, I will pass on to Mark, who can kick off the presentation.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Thanks very much for having us, and thank you for the other panellists joining us today. So as Naomi referenced, today we're talking about how to engage Gen Z. And specifically, we want to go through this kind of running order. So we want to look at stereotypes, which typically aren't that useful, versus reality based on data and research that we've conducted. We want to look at the expectations of Gen Z and how they may or may not differ from generations that have gone before them. We want to articulate this core challenge and then look at what are the solutions to this core challenge of how do we engage with Gen Z. And we've then got these amazing panelists to talk a little bit about how they're engaging with Gen Z or thinking about Gen Z, and then we've got plenty of time at the end, I'm sure, for your questions and to answer your questions. Okay, so before we get on to the meat of the kind of presentation, the webinar, just a very brief kind of who are Gen Z and why should you care? So there are lots of different definitions of Gen Z. We're roughly characterising them as between the ages of 11 and 21. Others you'll find are saying they're now entering the workplace and they're kind of 22, 23. And obviously these definitions are a bit of a sliding scale, but for the purposes of this webinar, this is kind of the age group that we're looking at. And then I think it's really important to differentiate the idea between demographic age groups and also generations, which are kind of shaped by a collective experience that no other generation shares or has. And that, I think that kind of overriding thing with Gen Z is this idea that they're digital natives. So millennials did grow up, well, millennials have been exposed a lot to being online and digital media, but they didn't necessarily grow up their whole lives knowing it. It's kind of been introduced while they were relatively young, whereas Gen Z, they've only ever known the internet. They've only really ever known mobile phones. So that's kind of one of the defining characteristics of Gen Z. And, you know, we'll be looking a little bit more about how that's shaping their worldview and their perceptions and their interaction with brands. Why should you care about Gen Z? I mean, you know, you're on this webinar, I'm sure, for these reasons, which is they're about to enter the workplace, so they're about to have their own economic power, their own spends, independent of their parents, and so they're starting to make decisions around the brands that they're going to be choosing, possibly for the rest of their lives. And of course, you know, that's the ultimate goal, to not just to have one interaction with a customer, but to build this idea of lifetime value and loyalty. And hopefully, if you can get it right, then there's an awful lot of economic value to be had from winning over Gen Z at this early age. And then finally, a little bit more superficial, but every kind of next generation or youth generation tend to be the tastemakers and the trendsetters that people listen to, the media like to write about, everyone likes to talk about. And so it's great to kind of have their ear and understand them. And they often set the pace and they they kind of set what's being talked about in the media. So for the kind of the rest of this webinar, that is who we are looking at as being Gen Z, and this is why you should care. Okay, so let's talk a bit about stereotypes versus reality. Now on here you've got a few statements, half a dozen statements, and these are all statements that I kind of Googled and tried to pick out as general sentiments that people believe about Gen Z, and we wanted to dive in and see whether they're really true or not necessarily true. So we're going to look through a series of slides now around whether Gen Z are savvy about blocking unwanted ads, about whether they really do hate advertising in general, whether they are more heavily influenced by social media than other generations, whether they are less materialistic and more experience-driven, whether they really do have this extra strong sense of social justice, and whether their kind of purchase decisions are really driven by ethical and values-based considerations versus other generations. And just a quick note on where this data has come from. So this has all come from research conducted by Attest. So we are a brand and market intelligence platform, as Naomi mentioned. We sit on top of a myriad of different panels and sample providers, including our own, which gives us access to roughly 70 million consumers across 80 different countries. And so we've been pulling this data from our panel. And one thing that I'll talk quite a bit about in the next few slides is this idea between relative and absolute numbers, but I'll bring that up when it's relevant. Okay, so the first statement, savvy about blocking unwanted ads, true or false? The research suggests it's pretty true. In fact, Naomi referenced that in the introduction. So 75% of Gen Z have some kind of ad blocking installed on their devices, which is, a huge amount. And it just shows the difficulty of getting through to this generation through kind of traditional I say traditional advertising, but programmatic isn't specifically traditional, but programmatic advertising in particular is impacted by ad blockers, as you'd imagine. And you can see, so when you're looking at these results that were pasted in, I draw your eye to the fact that in each one there's kind of a dotted line across each horizontal result, and that's the average. That's the national average. And then the shaded bit is how Gen Z have responded. So you can see where they're under or over the national average. And so on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that I've highlighted in blue that one of the main reasons Gen Z have stopped buying from a particular brand is because they received too much marketing from them. Now, they're over-indexing on that versus the rest of the population, so they're more sensitive to it than other generations, effectively. So that's a big call out. You've got to be sensitive when engaging with Gen Z about just how much promotional activity you're undertaking. So this is where I'm going to talk relative and absolute. So relative to the general population, they're a bit more sensitive to advertising. However, in absolute terms, the number one thing that will still drive them away from your brand is poor customer service. So you can't ignore the basics, effectively. You've got to give them great customer service, just like anyone else. And then another interesting point on this stat before we move on is just this idea of how influenced they are by negative reviews online. So, having that kind of brand, brand management, understanding how your brand is being talked about online, reviewed online, very, very important when it comes to winning over and keeping loyal Gen Z, because they are very influenced by that. Okay, hate is obviously a very strong word, but do they hate all brand advertising? I mean, untrue, effectively. So we've just looked at a slide where we kind of talked about how averse they are to some forms of advertising, but when we've asked them about social advertising, we actually found they're a lot more receptive to this. So when they're on these kind of channels that they feel comfortable with, they've said that they're actually quite receptive to speaking with and engaging with brands. And so I'll talk through each of these three data points here. So on the left-hand side, which social platforms do you prefer to see brands advertising? This roughly mirrors another question that's not shown, which was, which social networks do you use most? And so what's interesting about this is if they use Facebook a lot, they prefer brands to be on Facebook. If they use Instagram a lot, they prefer brands to be on Instagram. So they're not saying, well, I use Instagram a lot, I prefer brands to advertise on Snapchat where I'm not hanging out. They're saying I want brands to be on the same channels that I am. And that's the important takeaway from here. And you can also see that there's more shading on almost all of those social channels, full stop, which indicates that Gen Z are just more active on social channels.
Yeah. Just to add a point to that, Mark, I think one thing that I noticed when I look at this, particularly the graph on the left here, is that there's an approximate correlation that I see between the preference to see advertising on different channels with the targeting capability of those channels. So Facebook typically is renowned for having very, very strong targeting capabilities. And this to me suggests that it's also about wanting to see relevant ads, of course, and growing up in an always online world, and therefore having grown up with that sense that I would like to see ads that are relevant to me because they're beneficial. I don't want to see marketing in the sense of spammy, irrelevant materials. So to me, there's a relevancy piece here as well as a channel piece.
It's a really great point, absolutely. And there's a later slide where we'll talk a little bit about personalization as well and how important that is to Gen Z. And so in this middle column, you'll see that do you follow brands on social media, and if so, why? Absolutely, they do follow brands on social media. The fourth column down there, no, I don't follow brands on social media, as you can see, is much under, they're very under indexed on that as Gen Z. Most people in that generation will follow brands on social media, and they do so for offers and discounts and the latest product updates, the same kind of things that everyone else does. So they're not brand averse, they're bad advertising averse, I think is the key point to look at here.
Do you think, perhaps a question here, do you think there's an element also of following brands as a way to signal brand affiliation and communicate their own brand?
I think so. I think, again, I don't know how differentiated Gen Z are, but in many other generations, they absolutely indicate their identity by following and engaging with brands that they care about and they want to.
And they're much more choosy as well. They're not labelling themselves with big brands blazoned across their chests. They're very selective in their brands and how they portray themselves affiliated with that brand.
Yeah.
Just to put this, I mean, we've done quite a lot of research into looking at this idea of kind of personal branding, and it seems that is actually a real key driver for this particular generation. They see themselves as a brand. So at this point in time, it's not that they're trying to associate themselves with this cool brand. They're going, okay, well, actually, that brand needs to associate themselves with me. Mm-hmm. And that's I think that has a massive impact here. So the game has completely changed in that sense.
Really interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, this, again, is not going to be very surprising to people. More heavily researched by social, we find that they, by and large, are. So do they, which social networks do they use on a daily basis? Essentially all of them, more than the general population. Much more connected and engaged on social media overall. What types of people do they follow? Again, generally, almost all of them. They're more active, they're more engaged. They're more likely to follow global brands and sports stars and independent brands than pretty much any other population, any other generation. Over the last 7 days, how often did you check your social media newsfeed? Again, much more frequently. And then this is an interesting one over on the right-hand side. So when I want to buy something, I first turn to, and I've highlighted in blue, social media, because they're roughly twice as likely to first turn to social media than the general population. But again, so relative to everyone else, they're much more likely to turn to social media. But in absolute terms, they're still going to Google, they're still going to Amazon, more so even than social media. So I think the game is changing, and it's much more important in the way Gen Z think about brands and think about their purchasing decisions, but it's still relative. You still need to have a great game on Google, be very, very good at search engine optimization. And Amazon, I think, is very interesting because across all generations, Amazon is really starting to rival Google as the first point of search, not the second. And so I think if you're selling a product, a physical product, You might want to look at cutting a deal with Amazon and joining their marketplaces. A lot of big brands are starting to do, albeit sometimes reluctantly.
Yeah, there's I think a relevant point there on the Amazon piece in particular, where if you're listing your product on Amazon, recognizing that is the first point of comparison means that having a optimal price point on Amazon is absolutely critical. Even if someone actually buys elsewhere, they're going to establish their anchor price point probably by looking at Amazon for many, many products. There's another point on this slide, on the left-hand graph here. For me as a marketer, something that I intuitively feel like I know is that Snapchat and Instagram are very, very important channels for this audience, and the Attest data very clearly supports that. And for me, the takeaway for any marketer looking at this slide is if you're not using Instagram and in particular Snapchat, you're trying to reach Gen Z, you're probably missing a significant chunk of the potential there.
Absolutely. Okay, this is a potentially controversial slide to an extent. So are they less materialistic and more experience driven? Well, the data says a bit of both, to be honest. I put untrue, which is a little bit too binary because you've got to look at this again in relative and absolute terms. So in relative terms, they do say they're more, their kind of personality is more reflected by things like the clothes that they wear and the things that they own than the general population. But again, in absolute terms, they're still more defined by the experiences that they have and the company that they keep. So I think it's too easy to say Gen Z are absolutely driven by just experiences, they're non-materialistic, etc. I don't think that is entirely true, and that's what I'm trying to highlight here. But it's equally true that they care about experiences more so than clothes and things they own still.
But I think those are the clothes I wear and things I own hark back to the previous slide we're talking about and the brand identity that they have. So it's not necessarily the big materialistic luxury brands. It's more, it could be second-hand clothes, but it's an expression of themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. It doesn't mention brands here at all.
Yeah.
It could be very independent clothing. It could be, it's definitely not necessarily a statement of mainstream brands define who I am.
Yeah, and I also think that this generation is incredibly ambitious, and it's not that they value one thing over the other, it's that they genuinely believe they can have it all, and so that's what they're going for. They are the dreamers.
In a different way to millennials.
Yeah, I think millennials are very much idealists, whereas Gen Z are kind of the dreamers. Yeah, and they don't see failure as an option. They think genuinely, I can achieve every part of this.
It's a really good point. So we, not in this webinar, but as part of this body of research we did into the different attitudes and beliefs of all the generations, we're just focusing on Gen Z here, and we saw this big spike in boomers who are kind of optimistic about life and what they can achieve. And then there's a dip, a very distinct dip around Gen X and millennials, and then it really upticks again with Gen Z who really feel like life's going to be better, they can make a big difference. We've definitely got the data that backs that up as well.
I think there's also an interesting point here around how the question's phrased here. My personality is reflected by these things, and it could well be that the importance of experiences that we see here on the slide speaks more to the fact that the motivation for that is internal. So that's about creating memories, connecting with friends, following interests and pursuits, whereas clothing and things that you own, the motivation there perhaps might be more external, communicating brand affiliation or the like to the external environment. Yeah. Since they're not experiences aren't tangible, sustaining things, but they're internalized as memories.
Absolutely. There is a big difference, and wording is so important with these things. So this was about personality. It doesn't specifically say identity, and I think often identity is that external reflection of personality. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Okay, a strong sense of social justice. Again, these are just a few of the different data points that we had that kind of reflect the sentiment of Gen Z, but you can see they really over-index on their feelings towards the importance of ending discrimination, this middle one was that you can't see the whole sentence, but there is not enough diversity on mainstream television. And on the far right, transgender-friendly toilets are a good thing, essentially. So very strong sense of social justice, much more so than every other generation or the public at large, effectively. So these all of these topical areas are very, very well supported by Gen Z. And I don't think there's anything more to say on that one. It's pretty clear, the evidence is pretty clear. But does that drive their purchase decisions? And I think, I've saved this one to last because I thought this was the most important. So push come to shove, when I buy from brands, what is it that I'm looking for? And they've ranked this. So at the top is the most important factor, and down at the bottom is the least most important factor that they look at when buying from brands. And so you can see at the top, best value for money. Have they bought it before and do they trust it? So trust is one of the key things there. Offer the most choice, the most convenience. Have they been recommended by friends or family? And then the bottom three are all these kind of more values-based things. So do brands share my values and beliefs? Do they act ethically? Do they speak my language? Kind of whatever that means. But they're right at the bottom. And I thought that was really interesting. I was expecting maybe some difference. And Gen Z essentially have the exact same ordering as every other generation. Millennials, boomers, Gen X, every one of them ordered this question in exactly the same way. And so, is it enough to speak my language, to kind of speak in the language of Gen Z and really tout your ethical kind of prowess? That's probably not the right word, but and the fact that you share the values and beliefs of Gen Z, all things being equal, possibly, but not if your product isn't as good or you don't offer as good an experience. That is still the driving factor. You have to deliver a great product at great value, and you have to offer a fantastic brand experience. Those things will still outweigh pretty much everything else, whether it's Gen Z or any other generation. Don't know if you guys want to say anything on this.
I think it's, as you say, Mark, it's a similar set of values to other demographics. But I think one point that always strikes me about Gen Z is this is a generation that grew up impacted by the recession, 2008 and 2009. Similarly, it's a generation it's at the beginning of their earning potential, and therefore they're going to have less disposable income. So prioritizing that more highly is I'm sure a factor. It's interesting that's also true for other demographics as well, but I would imagine that both frugality combined with digital ubiquity, having been online since birth, means that they're much, much more price sensitive and price comparing.
Yeah. And I think this statement, this is about, actually buying and purchasing, but I think as a life stage, they're younger and ethically they are much more aligned to things that are ethical, and therefore they might not be able to afford them, as you said, but they're in their minds, I think it's still important, that ethical side. But I agree with this, it's about best value for money at this stage when they're purchasing.
Yeah, and I definitely want to, make sure I'm pretty clear on this, which is, it's not that ethics doesn't matter and you shouldn't be driving to be ethical. It is important, but it's never going to trump offering a poor service or a bad value product. That you need to focus on the basics, and then you can outcompete people by kind of differentiating along the lines that Gen Z will be looking for, by acting ethically, by sharing their values and beliefs, etc.
Yeah, no, completely agree with that. I think what's also really interesting is just I think there is a very obvious, at least I think, within their mindset, that they don't see that their values and beliefs actually necessarily being a part of their consumer habits as well. Like, they are very separate things, and actually they are very driven about social justices and issues like that, and they very much have a voice there that they want to put forward. But I don't think they can integrate those into their consumer habits at this point. So yeah, very much as everyone else.
And actually that's backed up by quite a lot of employee employer studies about how the companies that they want to work for need to have that ethical background and that underlying. There is that belief that filters into the way that they want to live their life.
So they're integrating it in ways that they feel that they can, which obviously this point is not.
So that's a really great point. Thank you. Okay, so the core challenge restated. How do we connect with Gen Z in a natural way that wins their attention? So kind of pulling all this together into a few core solutions in this very pretty slide is don't forget the basics. Value for money, including discounts and offers, offering choice and convenience, great service and experience, really, really important. And just to really go into that great experience and service, it's even more important for Gen Z because they are so vocal about their experience on social. So I'm going to reference some data that I couldn't pack the slide with too many frames of data, but there's more data that we've got that shows that Gen Z are much more likely to both praise and complain about brands online and on social media channels. So if you're delivering great service, it's going to get amplified. If you're delivering a poor service, it's also going to get amplified. Clearly, we've seen, throughout this presentation so far, just how important social media is, and it's absolutely essential. Almost all those channels are dominated by great imagery, so thinking particularly here of Instagram and Snapchat. I think YouTube often gets forgotten, but there's an awful lot of data to show just how important YouTube is to this generation, how much time they spend with it. Really, really critical aspect of succeeding, I think. So YouTube's not necessarily a classic social channel, so to speak, but please, don't forget it. They spend a lot of time on that channel. And then, of course, the importance of endorsements and influencers in terms of affecting purchase behaviour. I also wanted to re-highlight again that Amazon is vying with Google as that first port of call for purchases. So don't forget that. It's very easy to spend a lot of budget on SEO to become top of Google, but it's also increasingly important to be at the top of Amazon's search results as well. And then, again, we didn't display the data that kind of proves these things, but when we asked a couple of questions. One was, would you prefer kind of services delivered as a kind of web-based browser experience or a dedicated native app? Gen Z massively ranked apps as more preferable than the rest of the population, and also hugely wanted personalization, like really, really keen to have that personalized experience, from brands, from advertising, etc. So, to Marino's earlier point, they don't hate all advertising, they hate bad advertising. And if you can personalize it to their interests and their needs, I think they're actually reasonably receptive to it. Again, probably much like any other generation.
Yeah, I think something that strikes me is there's a piece here around brands need to display loyalty to Gen Z. They shouldn't expect Gen Z to display loyalty to the brand. So it sort of reverses the traditional brand promise. And I think the best expression of that is, how does a brand display loyalty to Gen Z? Well, it does that through respect and relevance, relevant advertising, algorithmic recommendations for the like of Amazon, show them things that they want to see, that they've told the brand they want to see. And with that, the brand buys, that doesn't buy, but earns the loyalty and respect of that. So it's much more of a two-way street, I feel like, between Gen Z and brands. I think one other piece that's sort of related is I feel like there is much more acceptance of different value propositions, different pricing, for example, amongst Gen Z. So, the classic way of marketing is you have one price for every product. Gen Z is much more open to charge me different amounts of money for different levels of service, different delivery speeds, but also even for the product itself according to my need in that moment, because they live online, they live in a world of where nothing is a fixed number. Everything moves based on relevancy. Great example of this, maybe to illustrate it, is Uber surge pricing. If you're of an older generation, that is a odd but something that you accept way of pricing things. To Gen Z, the concept that I really, really want a taxi right now and everyone else does, and therefore I'll pay more, is absolutely ubiquitous.
Yeah, great points. Thanks. Okay, one last slide before we move on to kind of look at the other panelists and conscious of time, so I won't spend too long here. We asked open-ended question, name a brand that is your favourite brand. And you can see here, Nike, Apple, Adidas, McDonald's, Cadbury's, etc. So actually some older brands in there still maintaining relevance, and I guess that's the one thing I wanted to speak to on this slide, which is, just because you've been around for a while doesn't mean you can't stay relevant for Gen Z. If you get it right and you appeal to them in the right way, then absolutely you can stay top of mind with Gen Z. And with that, we'll pass on to Tanya from Discovery.
Great, thanks. There's lots to say about Gen Z, and one of the big statements that they're making is that TV is dead, and that the death of TV is marching closer and closer, and they hate TV. But actually, given the discussions that we've just heard, and the need to understand and connect with Gen Z in a natural way, I think we need to start thinking about what their definition of TV is. So it is true to say that they're spending less time with traditional linear TV schedules, but actually extensive industry research shows that they are watching more and more video content than ever before. And that video content comes in lots of different forms. And we talked about YouTube, which is just a fundamental, essential component of their video diet. But they're also watching long-form traditional content. It's just on different delivery systems. So over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about what Discovery Communications is doing in this space, and how we're reaching out to new audiences through new platforms and innovative engagement tactics for us that we think work for Gen Z and millennials in their space. So I would be wrong not to put up a slide that shows you our global footprint. We're a company that has a huge global coverage, and I'm just going to spend a few seconds on the big numbers. So globally, we have 3 billion cumulative viewers in over 220 countries, and that with over 70 brands out there. So we have a massive reach. That reach is slightly older than what we're talking about here, and that's now we're looking at how we convert to the Gen Z. So that's all I'm going to say on that slide. This is about how our brands are out there and the brands that we have, but Gen Z see TV not as the flat screen in the corner of the room, as I said, but actually as a selection of shows. And the delivery platform is in many ways secondary consideration to how they consume their consumption, because programs is what television is all about, and programs can now be viewed across multiple devices and at times that suit individuals for as long as they want, and it's what Gen Z expect. As we talked about, they're digital natives. It's not even thought of that you could consume TV content in any other way. And a recent research study from Hulu in the US showed that 84% of Gen Z consider streaming to be watching TV. So therefore it's about content, and we need to present our content in the spaces that they are. And Discovery Communications looks at its brands in this context, and we're looking at more and more in the context of content is key, and we do deliver entertaining, inspiring video content to that global audience through the diversity of our brands. And these diverse brands encompass key content focused on superfans. So we look at them as groups of people that are watching types of content, whether that be in the non-fiction space, sports, or kids. I mean, it's a common misconception that Gen Z hates all brand advertising, as we've just had extensive discussions about. And in actual fact, in the world of digital natives, and subscription model advertising is a rare commodity for these viewers. So if you can engage them with your brand advertising, they will engage with it and enjoy it. And for Discovery, we are all about tapping into their passions. And we also talked about trust being a big issue for global brands. And for Gen Z, it shows that actually, numerous studies will cite that they're less brand conscious, and that to label yourself as a brand means that you're part of an establishment. But Discovery has always been a strong mission-driven company, which, even though there are indications that the ethics are a little bit superseded, and we talked about that, the underlying message of our brand, the brand must be true, and this is something that's ingrained in Discovery in terms of our brands engage at different levels through the content, and we really resonate with our linear viewers, and we're now looking to take that into a digital and online space. If we go to the next slide. So with all of that in mind, we're looking at how we're pushing our content across all the platforms. I've already mentioned that we have a strong social media presence, and we're over 400 million global social followers. And this is something we take really seriously, and are really excited engaging young viewers with our video content across all these different types of platforms. Discovery Communications recently announced that we'll be creating shows for Facebook and in their new Watch platform, and these will be premium mid-form shows that are both inspired by our leading Discovery properties as well as exclusive properties for Facebook. So we're working with our superfan groups with releases from Animal Planet, Investigation Discovery and TLC, and lots more to come. Facebook's Watch launched in August to a limited group in the US and be rolling out over more broadly in the coming months. So we are working closely with Facebook because they also share the commitment to engage passionate fans and create communities. As we talked about, that social space is very important, and that's where our video content needs to be. In addition, you can see from this slide that Discovery is engaging with content on numerous platforms. We have the TV Everywhere apps in the US, and we also have a lot of video-on-demand content deals with affiliates. So we supply our content for those who have paid TV anywhere and everywhere, dependent on their subscriptions. And in addition to this, we're utilising our amazing Eurosport player direct to the consumer. So we're providing sports content across all screens, working closely with established local and international players to create channels and content packages that go directly to the consumer rather than just sitting behind several paywalls. These consumers are younger than our linear TV and are becoming exposed to our content and therefore our brands within this space. For us, it's not all about the long form either. It's may well have been our staple for over 30 years, but we acknowledge that video content to Gen Z is practically everything that moves from the long form to a GIF. So therefore, whether they are learning and empathizing in terms of picking up news, videos, or just giggling about kittens, the video is any sort of video is content. And therefore, in 2016, we made a strategic investment partnership with Group 9, which has things like Thrillist, Now This, The Dodo, and Discovery's Seeker. And these are now the largest digital content companies with 4.5 billion monthly streams. So you see that we diversify and we're finding Gen Z where they are and working in their space. In addition to the relationship with Facebook, I wanted to touch upon partnership with Snapchat, which actually, given all the conversation that we've been talking about, makes me even more excited, around the Olympic Games. So we have Eurosport, which is part of Discovery Communications, and we hold the European license for the Olympic Games, which for us starts in February with the Winter Olympics. And the Olympics is a property that means something to everyone across all ages. And with this partnership, we intend to engage a younger, mobile-first audience with the Olympic Games content across Europe through Snapchat. So we'll be delivering on commitment to bring world-class sports to a new audience on more screens and services across more markets than ever before. We have a portal to an entirely fresh audience base, an opportunity to engage and introduce them. There's 55 million Snapchatters get an exclusive shareable, snackable Olympic game content from Eurosport. It's the first of its kind deal with fastest growing social network. It's got some great stats here. Users younger than 25 visit Snapchat more than 20 times a day and spend 30 minutes with content. So through that, we'll be redefining the viewer experience in sport through immersive content and innovative technologies, bringing the fans closer to the action across the devices and empowering consumers to share. I could go on and on, there's a lot to say, but if we just go on to the next slide. In addition to all that stuff that we're doing with Gen Z in terms of the video and where it is and finding them and trying to make a relationship with them in their natural environment, I just wanted to talk about Discovery as a company and the global impact we make and the ethics point that we were talking about earlier. So one of the things I've talked about is that we are a purpose-driven company, and we're dedicated to entertaining, inspiring, and giving back to our communities where we live and work. So through our impact programs, we undertake change in our own communities with the Discovery as a whole has a World Impact Day, where we as employees go out and are given the opportunity to make a difference for the day to our own community. And this purpose-driven mission, I think, still resonates with Gen Z. Younger generations have always been driven by their ethics to a greater degree than their older counterparts. And for me, it's kind of a life stage thing, not an age thing. But as I said earlier, it's evidenced in business literature that Gen Z will demand more ethical approaches from their employees. And this is something that Discovery just excels in. So I think as a company, we're hitting the right buttons through our content distribution and being mission driven. Means that by finding the right platforms, and we're still learning, there's still a lot to learn about how to get this content out there in the right spaces. But we are finding ways to engage with Gen Z in really new and exciting ways.
We've got a question that's come through. So this is kind of for the whole panel. Obviously, you mentioned, Mark, that social justice is key for Gen Z, and is there a potential risk that some brands could come across as jumping on the bandwagon in a sense? And how can brands keep their natural tone of voice when they're purporting their social justice? Any thoughts on that?
Authenticity is a massive driver for Gen Z and their association with brands. It is really important that brands do come across as independent and authentic in that space. But I also think there probably isn't going to be too much criticism about a brand jumping on the bandwagon, because ultimately, if they are doing what they say they are doing and aligning themselves with that social justice, then there isn't that much to criticise. Like, doing good is still doing good in that sense, and actually, I think that is what Gen Z will look at before they start going, okay, what are actually their motives for this?
Less cynical than their prior generations, maybe. Great.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to jump in there and just say, well, there was quite a lot of backlash around Pepsi's commercial a few months ago. I'm maybe not meant to name names, but there you go. And they had this big advert with Kendall Jenner, was it? And essentially trying to align themselves around this movement for social justice in the US, and it just got a lot of flack, and they ultimately pulled it because people were kind of like, well, this is not representative of your brand. What are you actually doing towards this sentiment? And I think that was a really good example of jumping on the bandwagon with an advertising-led approach rather than a belief or a cultural-led approach where the business stands for something and their actions speak louder than words ultimately. So I think you're right. I think if companies are evolving to be more ethical and to stand for something beyond just profit, I don't think they're ever going to receive a great deal of flack for that. It's if it's superficial and it's not really
not transparent at all.
It's about aligning yourself with the right cause ultimately.
And I think your word chart proves that with McDonald's and how they've changed the way that they talk about themselves and stand true to what they're saying within their advertising. Yeah, and it's obviously resonating.
Yeah, I think tactically, any time that's associated with a campaign rather than a built-in philosophy for the company, there's a risk there that it's going to be seen as insincere, which it probably would be if it's associated with a campaign. So to me, if I contrast the Pepsi example with something like Patagonia, where they build that deeply into how they do business consistently, then that comes across as much more authentic.
Yeah. So social justice as a campaign equals no. Social justice as a company, absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks. So we're moving on to Marino.
Eventbrite. So just a few words from me, particularly with a focus on the events and the experience aspects of Gen Z. So 4 key points here. First of all, we spoke earlier about experiences as a reflection of personality for Gen Z, and the fact that they under-index slightly on that, which is absolutely true. But that said, that's still the number one area that Gen Z are looking at. And what we've seen is that the number of people that are choosing experiences, going out, seeking out events is much higher than it's been even a year ago. There's a desire to do more rather than to have more. We see that across all demographics, but that's particularly true for Gen Z. And actually with Gen Z, they are also particularly willing to sacrifice other things to fund that. Sacrifice buying things or material goods to fund that. And that speaks to both their frugality and their lower earning potential at this point in their lives. With that growing experience economy, they also have a significantly higher set of expectations around what those experiences are, the quality of them. Again, that reflects back to what we saw on the slide around for buying physical goods, the importance of customer service, the importance of good standards as well. So much higher expectations around what they're going to get from these experiences. And there's been a move away from traditional forms of entertainment as well. So Gen Z are much less likely to go to nightclubs, go to the pub, and they're much more likely, still do that, but they're less likely to. They're much more likely to seek out unusual, different experiences, food festivals, art events, particularly immersive hybrid events where you're combining perhaps a music festival with a food event with something else. So they're seeking unique, unusual, memorable experiences. The food festivals in particular are very much on the rise, and fitness is another key theme on the experience side of things. 1 in 5 of them are going to more fitness classes than previously. And then just casting back to the point around ubiquity of digital devices and the always online generation. This also speaks to the increasing focus that Gen Z has around combining the online and the offline. So we're also seeing events and experiences, when they want to reach this audience successfully, much more consciously spill over into the online. And that includes content, YouTube, any other forms of content, both pre-event and post-event, to extend the experience, and also at the event itself, VR, AR, ways that the technology and the apps can extend that experience into the online world as well. There's a desire for diversity. We spoke about that earlier as well. For Gen Z, in terms of experiences, that desire for diversity is expressing itself as a desire to use these experiences to achieve a more diverse set of objectives, if you like. So it's about meeting people, it's about finding love, it's about getting outside their comfort zone, learning a new thing. And actually, for many Gen Z, it's about several of those all at once in the same event. So they're looking for more different things to achieve at any experience. We spoke a little bit about the online side of things, and it's absolutely true that this is the Instagram generation. If it's not Instagrammable, then it's not something that they want to do. And because Instagram is so important, and they want to take a picture of everything, it means that there is much, much higher standard needed for any brand that's using experiences. That experience is going to be all over Instagram, and therefore the standard that needs to be achieved is just that much higher.
Could I just jump in,
please,
with a couple of quick examples? So there's a couple of interesting things around that needing to be Instagrammable. So there's now consultancies out there that will go into restaurants and completely redesign their menu, but also their look and feel specifically so that they're Instagrammable.
Like off the food itself?
Yeah, so they'll think about having props in the restaurant that people want to take a picture next to or and share with the social group. So there's this whole mini burgeoning industry around making restaurants Instagrammable, very specifically. So that's one, and then the other around a famous brand is Haagen-Dazs have just completely rebranded and repackaged specifically so that their packaging is Instagrammable, and they're speaking out about that as a kind of project.
That's fascinating, because that sort of implies in one sense that, for the restaurant example, perhaps that could be seen as a bit shallow of the restaurant, trying to optimize for Instagrammability rather than edibility. But to me, it's not one thing or the other. Part of the experience of going out to an event or to a restaurant is the food, part of the experience is the company, but increasingly part of the experience is, do I get a great Instagram picture out of it? That is part of the benefit of the experience itself.
Yeah, that's so true.
Obviously, we're all of Gen Z are seeking unique experiences, as you said. We've got a question from the audience that's come in, and Ellie is asking, do you think experiential is a better way of advertising to Gen Z than traditional video marketing?
I think they're not mutually exclusive, and I think any advertising strategy that wants to effectively reach Gen Z needs to combine all of these into a holistic campaign. So for Gen Z, they're going to want to engage with compelling, rich experiential campaigns, but they're also going to want to then extend that online before and afterwards through the video, etc. So I don't see them as components that you need for any creative campaign. I wouldn't see them as an either or.
Separate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So then on the wellness front, which I've briefly mentioned, health is a very, very important thing, very important theme here. Something that we've seen in the types of experiences that Gen Z are seeking out, and this is also true for millennials, is there is much, much less focus on alcohol. That's a little bit driven by social media in part, but it's much more about alcohol. Pubs, nightclubs are seen as for the older generation, not cool, not something you do, and instead going for things that are more Instagrammable, perhaps. Food experiences are much more important. And then lastly, there's a piece around sort of keeping it real here, or IRL if you like, which is really the fact that one very important thing for Gen Z is they want to remember the experience. So they want to be in the moment, and that's not at odds with being on your phone, because that's a way of recording and sharing that moment, and for them to engage with that moment online as well as offline. But they want to retain and share that moment. So hence Instagram, hence Snapchat, hence channels like that for doing that. So taking the real life experience and not, again, sort of seeing that as opposed to the online part of that. Looking at the event through their phone and loading it up in real time, that is part of the experience extended across multiple channels for them as well.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Beth, would you like to talk a wee bit about what Social Chain are up to?
Sure, this is a nice slide.
Thank you.
I'm not very good at slides, so you'll have to so just to kind of give you a bit of background on kind of how Love Food fits into what Social Chain do. The Social Chain Group is a marketing agency and also media owner. We have a collection of kind of like social communities that have a reach now of around 380 million. Some of those larger communities we have then turned into media brands in their own right. So Love Food is an example of that. So now that we kind of have our own brands in-house, this has been a really interesting topic for us because we've had to do really in-depth research into this particular generation, as a massive percentage of the audience we have actually falls into Gen Z. So we kind of took it really back to basics. We kind of like to think of ourselves as sort of amateur psychologists in this sense, and like how do we strip it right back to actually becoming a part of somebody's life as a brand. So we have looked at this idea of that Gen Z growing up and kind of what they're consuming and how do we actually become an integral part of that. So what do we know about them? They're connected from birth. They have so much choice. There's studies that show that we are now consuming it's like 120 newspapers worth of content a day. And where 50 years ago your average attention span was 42 seconds, it's now 8 seconds. So you are literally fighting everyone just to be seen. And that is quite a tricky thing to kind of stand out from. It is incredibly noisy. obviously we did all the insights about who they're listening to, who they're influenced by. They are incredibly savvy when it comes to influencer-based marketing, and we're having to really change our tactics now and trying to get through to this generation, because they just see straight through it. They can see that person's being paid, and they don't care. They are looking for real people and, again, authenticity. Our advice to brands has been, okay, you need to engage with Gen Z to align yourselves with their passions, which, as we discussed, are social justice. It is their ambitions. It is the fact that they think they can have it all, and actually we don't disagree. At the moment, their consumer habits, maybe it's on the lower end of the scale commercially, so why are they worth investing in? Well, because they won't always be on that lower end. In 5-10 years' time, once they're much more able to spend more considerable amounts of money, where's your brand going to be then? So you need to be core to their beliefs now, and how do you do that? So it's really interesting, looking at the webinar earlier for who is doing really well. It is your big sports brands and my own source. The reason that they're doing so well is because they aren't necessarily selling to that audience at all. They are actually just educating them, and they're speaking to them about stuff that they actually care about. And that's, I think, really the way forward. You have to invest the time, you have to be a part of their journey. They, as we were discussing earlier again, in terms of personal brand, they are very focused on their own journey. And it's, as a brand, how do you facilitate that? They're not going to pick you. How do you become an integral part of how they live? How do you become the product they can't live without? And it is incredibly interesting. They are an incredibly resilient and pragmatic generation, and rather than hiding from problems, they're willing to go out and kind of search for them. And I guess it's just, how do you become a part of that voice, saying, okay, I know you can, you believe you can have anything, and so do we, and we're going to help you do that. And that's what we're trying to do now, talking to this generation. It's good for us in a way. In the social chain, the average age of our office is 24 years old, and a percentage of them are, the majority probably are Generation Z, so it's like, we're talking to our mates basically, so it's kind of easier. But that's kind of what we put forward. It's like, okay, maybe right now you're not going to see the commercial returns from this generation, but that doesn't mean they will not spend with you. Put in the work now, align yourselves with them, become an integral part of their day-to-day life. In 5 years' time, that is going to be the generation that goes, I know your brand and I trust it and I will buy from you and I will continue to. And that's basically our findings and where we stand on it and what we're pushing for now.
I think it's really true, and I think that's exactly where Discovery's at. I mean, we traditionally are not going after the younger audience, but what we need to be is in the space, because they're not. In the past, they were in linear TV and they would stumble across you and they'd watch with their parents, and then over time they would become a Discovery viewer. It's not going to happen now. They're not in that linear space, so we need to make our brand available in these different environments to become part of their lives later on. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's mind-boggling for us as well to see, because I'm 24, so my consumer habits online are so different to my friend who's 21. The Snapchat thing's really interesting, because I don't understand Snapchat at all. I tried, I don't get it, it's completely alien to me, and there's someone next to me who's using it, and it's like, how are these behaviours so different? Really? We're constantly trying to keep up with ourselves, and it's an incredibly exciting time for media, and to see how we progress and where content's going to be.
I think the big question is where advertising is going to go, because as we were talking earlier before we started, that subscription model videos means that you're not exposed to ads in the same way you were before. Your big reach always came off of linear TV around Christmas time, and now kids don't have Christmas lists.
I do, by the way.
Well, I
do. Brilliant. Thanks so much for all your insights, guys. I know we're running a little over time, but we definitely want to cover some of the questions that have been asked. So we forgive you if you have to run off. This webinar will be available to listen back to in our webinar library. So I'll crack on with question 1 for the panel. In terms of brands with small budgets, needing to prove return on investment, what is the most effective way of getting Gen Z interacting with them?
So repeat the question, sorry.
In terms of brands who have quite small budgets who need to prove return on investment, what's the most effective way of reaching Gen Z if there isn't that much money?
Well, I
to
think
spend?
there is so much you can do on social platforms. I mean, that's where Gen Z are. They're on social, and as we were talking about before, the Facebook targeting is incredible. Like really, it's so granular how you can look at actually, okay, this is my demographic, and they're interested in these, and these things. If you've got a really good understanding of who your audience are, a little money on Facebook can go a long way.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what I recommend.
I think just to pick up on that, one of the key things there is understanding who your audience are. And so that's what we're trying to get across throughout this, which is Gen Z shouldn't be seen as just one stereotype. They've got a lot of differences within Gen Z, a lot of different passions and experiences, and they care about different things. So I think you can't just say we're going to target Gen Z, boom, there's our targeting on Facebook. You have to actually understand what it is that they care about, what are their core motivations, their drivers, how do they already think about your brand versus competitor brands in your space. You've got to start with understanding, and I think if you've got a limited budget, it's more important than ever to spend a bit of time and money first understanding and then putting into practice your promotional strategies.
Yeah, I agree. I think Facebook, absolutely one of its powers is the ability to target, and the fact that there isn't a minimum spend level, which there is, for example, on Snapchat. But as we saw earlier, relevancy is key, and that, by the way, is also key for any Facebook targeting. So it would be looking at relevancy of message and then combining that with the right set of social media platforms. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks. And we know that quite a lot of Gen Z are using ad blockers, so obviously programmatic is affected. How should brands be approaching native advertising, and what are your tips and tricks for them to target Gen Z in that arena?
They are active consumers. They will look at content all day, and it's just about integrating yourself with the kind of content that they actually want to watch. I mean, as Love Food as a media platform, the way that our advertising works is that a brand will come to us and say, okay, we love the style that your content's in. Can we sponsor a piece of content for you to do exactly the same? And we'll appear and we'll have the whole handshake, Love Food with this brand element. And actually, it is an incredibly effective way of advertising because it's just the content they would be looking at anyway. And we see really high engagement levels, people actually building discussion around a particular brand in this way, and it's not intrusive. And that's the key, is they don't want to be intruded upon. They pick the content they want to see when they want to see it, which is why streaming services work so well.
Yeah, to me, content is often an overused buzzword at the minute. Content is king, all that good stuff, but it's that way for a reason. And I think if we think back to the slide we looked at around the starting point for a purchase experience, it's Google, it's Amazon, it's reviews, it's asking your friends. So what they're looking for is information, right? And ideally objective information. So to me, it seems like the kind of content that's going to resonate most with Gen Z is content that tells them objectively and usefully about your product or service. And hopefully it's a good product or service, right? It's targeted at Gen Z, but gives them that objective information, puts that forefront, rather than tries to communicate a brand promise without that underlying information. So I think it's about giving them substance that is objective and useful.
I totally agree. I think you've got to, again, going back to the data, you've got to give them a great customer experience. And actually, if you're going to spend, £25,000 on having someone that can provide a great customer experience because they can pick up the phone quicker or answer social media quicker and kind of provide that great brand experience versus spending it on programmatic where the ads are blocked, think about where you want to spend that money. And if you give them a great customer experience, they're more likely to speak about you positively on social media. People on this webinar probably know about Net Promoter Score and lots of NPS and tracking NPS, and that's a good way to know whether you're delivering that good customer experience and whether Gen Z would recommend you to their friends, and if they would, they probably are. So that's your kind of authentic and free organic promotion. So invest in the basics, and the good stuff should follow.
Yeah.
Amazon's a great example of that. Like in the early days, spending nothing on advertising and putting all of it into customer service, speed of delivery.
Yeah.
And they're doing okay.
All right, Mark, do you have any parting thoughts? Well, we have time for questions, really. So, anything you wanted to wrap up with?
So I think parting thoughts, they're kind of up on the screen again here. I just hope people found this interesting, possibly eye-opening in some instances where the data maybe didn't confirm your existing kind of preconceptions. And I think it's just, the key message is don't assume anything. You've got to go away. You've got to, don't treat people as stereotypes. Actually understand what they care about, what their motivators are, what their behaviours are, and that way you can kind of make a more accurate and pragmatic plan for engaging with Gen Z or any other consumer for that matter.
Okay, brilliant. I think that's us. So I'll just thank the panel today and thank our audience for joining, all armed with techniques to target Gen Z. And thanks to our partner Attest. So feel free to listen back to the webinar. It's going to be hosted on our webinar library on thedrum.com. And thank you very much. Good afternoon.